For those of you who've taken principles of microeconomics, this next segment will be, well, really familiar. And if you've not had that, well, hopefully this will provide some understanding of basic supply and demand in economics. All right, let's consider basic supply and demand curve. Now, what we want to look at is the supply and demand for food. Now, I realize that this is a bit of a theoretical construct. But assume for the sake of argument that we can consider all of the food that consumers would want being represented by this demand curve. It's downward sloping, suggesting as the price lowers, consumers are willing to consume more food, and as the price rises, consumers are willing to buy less food for those higher prices. We also have a supply curve that's upward sloping. And what the supply curve shows is farmers' willingness to provide food for us, and as the price rises, they provide more, but as the price falls, they'll provide less. For our discussion in this session, what I want us to consider are things that may shift the supply curve or shift the demand curve. And in shifting the supply curve or the demand curve, we can see increases in the price or decreases. Now, I don't want to worry about decreases in the price because our concern right now is the price increases in the 2007-2008 year and the price increases that we've seen most recently in 2011. So first, let's consider what happens when the supply curve shifts back. That is, shifts to the left. We see that the supply curve moves back and the price rises from P1 to P2. But then there can be another type of shift, and that's a shift in the demand curve, which shifts to the right, where the price also rises from P1 to P2. Notice in this case, however, when the demand curve shifts out, there is a greater quantity of food being consumed. What are those things that allow for demand to shift to the right and supply to shift to the left? Well, let's look at a few of those. Let's first talk about supply. Now, there are a number of factors that can allow the supply curve to move to the left or the right. Typically, we think of those things that are inputs into the production of the particular good, and also substitutions that, in this case, we would say farmers could substitute from food crops to other activities. So let's consider the first problem. And this has happened back in 2007-2008, and we saw a slightly different version of this in 2011, and that's bad weather. Back in 2007-2008, there were a number of droughts in the Pacific, and we saw that food prices began to rise because of limited supplies of wheat out of the Pacific Rim, particularly Australia. We can also see that there are other things that can affect the supply of food, in particular input costs, like rising petroleum prices. Now, petroleum is an important factor in the production of food for three reasons, at least three reasons: transportation, fertilizer is produced from petroleum or petroleum-based products, and land use. Let's take a moment to look at what happened to fuel prices in this period. As we can see, in the 2007 to 2008 period, there was a significant increase in prices of fuel. And this is from the, this data represents the price of fuel, short-term energy outlook. And we can also see that the price rose again in 2010 through 2011. So both of these price increases in fuel may have had something to do with the price increases of food. With those price increases, we can see that input costs increased because of transportation, fertilizer, and how farmers were able to use their land. But there are other factors that may shift the supply curve, such as government interventions. There can be agricultural policies that can move the supply curve either to the left or to the right. Now let's consider the demand. Now, demand can be an important factor for why we saw the price increases back in 2007, 2008, and then the recent price increases. One of the important factors that a lot of economists have considered are increases in income both in Asia and around the world, in particular India and China. The income growth in these countries may have allowed for consumers to buy more food, in particular more diverse foods, particularly meats. So the demand for food products probably had some factor in increasing the price of food. Fuel is another source of increase in demand. Now, this fuel is a slightly different notion. This is in the context of biofuels. Biofuels that have used corn or sugar, depending on which countries you're looking at, have caused or encouraged greater consumption of food products, or at least the use of land that might have been used for food products, and thus we see an increase in demand. Thus, price increases. Now, some have argued that there have been speculation or a run on the market that influenced the price of food. Commodities like corn and wheat are frequently traded on commodity exchanges. These commodity exchanges allow for farmers and other participants to enter into a market where they can buy contracts for grains. Well, it's not just farmers and food manufacturers who enter into these markets. It can be individuals like you and I who can purchase futures contracts. This is a highly complex market, and what we've seen is that the interest in biofuels and other related products has caused speculators to enter into the market, causing the price of food to rise. Exchange rates can also have an influence on what happens to the price of food. As the U.S. dollar has weakened in some of this time period, what we saw was an increased demand for U.S. goods, and thus an increase in the price that U.S. consumers saw. The same can also be true in other countries, and exchange rates can be a complex story, but they can all contribute to increases or decreases in demand. All of these factors come together to influence the prices that we've seen, but which one of these was most important? Well, it's hard to say. There's a great deal of research considering these points, but for us, for now, realize that all of these factors have had some part in the story of increased food prices. I want to take a moment to think a little bit more about biofuels and its role in food prices. Back in 2007, Runge and Sinauer worked on a piece in Foreign Affairs where they thought a little bit more carefully about biofuels. Here's what they said. Biofuels have tied oil and food prices together in ways that could profoundly upset the relationship between food producers, consumers, and nations in the years ahead, with potentially devastating implications for both global poverty and food security. One of my colleagues has argued that the Farm Bill, the bill that regulates agricultural production in the U.S., is now somewhat like an energy bill because of the use of biofuels. In this graphic, what I'd like for you to recognize is that there is a relationship between food and fuel. If you see in this graph, we see that by the time you reach the mid-2000s, food prices and fuel prices actually moved fairly closely together. They both experienced the rise in 2007, 2008, and the decline, and then the additional rise in 2010 to 2011. While it's hard to say that they are moving together in a statistical sense, some evidence has suggested that, we see graphically there is some evidence to suggest that they are moving together. But what does this mean? When we consider some work coming out of the World Bank, they argue that world maize production, maize is another name for corn, increased by 51 million metric tons between 2004 and 2007. Over the same period, we see that consumption of maize used in ethanol increased by 50 million metric tons. But there were also other consumption of maize which increased nearly 33 million metric tons. Here's an example of where demand increased to such a degree that we would believe that it led to an increase in the price of maize. Now, the effects of biofuels on food prices may have been somewhere between 10 and 40%. Now, what's really important, what makes this issue an issue for hunger studies is who is hurt. Now, I will tell you, you and I, if you live in the US or Western Europe or Canada, probably didn't really feel the effects of the increase in food prices as much as others did. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The diet of consumers in developed nations do not depend heavily on grains and oilseeds. We mostly eat a lot of meat, though I am a vegetarian. However, the diet of consumers in developing countries depend heavily upon grains and oilseeds. So when prices of grains and oilseeds increase, and these are commodities that are often used in the production of biofuels, we can see that these consumers are substantially hurt.